Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Line, Vice President of Global Talent Mobility at Cartus, based in Singapore. And today's virtual forum, which is the second in our continuing series, focuses on the impact of the current pandemic on immigration in ASEAN countries. Thank you all for choosing to spend an hour of your time with us today. It's really very much appreciated. In a moment, I'll introduce the team on the panel today, including our partners from Fragment, who are joining to present, and of course also to take part in a Q&A session with one of our directors and to answer questions that may come up from the floor as well. So feedback from our very first forum on the COVID-19 situation, which took place 2 weeks ago, overwhelmingly focused on a need to look more deeply at immigration. And so Cartus designed today's session with that in mind. If I look at our current conversations with our clients across the board and across all sectors, those conversations tend to cover a number of areas at the moment, as you would probably guess and imagine. So employee safety and logistics in time of a lockdown or a partial lockdown, sometimes statutory obligations, but almost always changing immigration rules and their application as part of that discussion. And as we all see as mobility professionals on a daily basis, global talent sourcing in the current environment is changing quite dramatically, and there's a definite need to redefine the future kind of post-normal business practices in this area. And so the purpose for today is to look at actionable intelligence in the area of immigration as it touches ASEAN countries. And also it's to provide an opportunity for questions and some answers to those questions. Let me quickly address some housekeeping items as well. So firstly, if everyone could mute your phones and PCs and any other devices you're calling in on, that would be fantastic. The very best way to ask questions in this type of forum that we've found is really to use the chat feature illustrated there. And anyone joining by audio only, and there may be a few of you, can receive a copy of this presentation by emailing Rachel Fu at cartus.com, and she will immediately get that presentation to you. I will read out her email address spelling, which is somewhat different to some other Rachels. RACHEAL.FOO@cartus.com, and one more time, RACHEAL.FOO@cartus.com. So once again, if you need a copy of the presentation now, please do email Rachel immediately and she will send that across to you straight away. The event's being recorded, and I believe everyone has made a decision either to join anonymously or with name, but just to reiterate, the session is being recorded and will be shared. We go to the agenda for today. We have 3 sections to the forum. The first is the Immigration Guideline Overview in ASEAN, which is a presentation from the Fragment partners with us. The second part of today is In Conversation. So Anu Pisapati, one of our directors based in Singapore, will be facilitating a Q&A session with Fragment. And third, we'll open that up to Q&A for everybody on the forum to ask questions of the Fragment team and the Cartus team as well. Okay, if I can move on to introducing your presenters for today. So Kenneth Lau, partner with Fragment based in Singapore, and Talia Wong, also a partner at Fragment in Singapore. Thank you guys very much for joining us today and sharing your insights and expertise. It's much appreciated. Anu also, thank you too. Anu's a director at Cartus based in Singapore, part of the global talent mobility business. And Alzone Ang, vice president global talent mobility at Cartus as well, based in Singapore, as am I. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Kenneth and Talia, and they can tell you a little bit more about themselves first before they get into their presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. My name is Kenneth Lau. As Rob mentioned, I'm a partner at Fragrance based in Singapore. I guess just some background on my team. So we cover those countries within the region where we engage local vendors or local co-counsels. So for all intents and purposes for the ASEAN region, that would include countries such as Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Thailand. So I'll cover some of those countries moving forward in the presentation. Talia?
Oh, thanks, Kenny. So hi, everyone. I'm Talia, and I oversee the Singapore inbound practice, where we assist with temporary work authorizations, permanent residence, and citizenship applications. And we also assist clients on immigration matters relating to mergers and acquisitions, as well as project moves into Singapore. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to now move on to speak about Singapore and share some of the latest updates. So since the end of January this year, the Singapore government started to take swift and decisive steps to put in place measures to reduce the number of imported cases, as well as to stem the spread of local transmission. So much like the rest of the world, Singapore's immigration restrictions initially focused on a number of countries. However, we've now come to a point where the restrictions apply to all countries. So on this slide, we'll be looking at the different groups of individuals and the immigration measures that have been put in place in relation to entry bans, entry approvals, the requirement to complete a health declaration, as well as the quarantine and stay-home notices. So starting with short-term travelers, which is the group seen on the left side of the bar. For this group, now Singapore is currently not allowing entry and transit for all short-term visitors. So while this was initially imposed on travelers coming from a handful of countries that were considered high risk, this ban has since been expanded on the 23rd of March to include all short-term travelers coming to Singapore from any part of the world. And so by short-term visitors, we basically mean those who do not hold any type of residency status in Singapore. Now, there are exceptions for foreign spouses and children of Singapore's citizens and permanent residents. So for this group, if they have exceptional circumstances and they need to travel to Singapore, they can submit an email to the ICA or the Immigration and Checkpoints Authority for consideration. So now moving on to the right side of the bar, we basically have grouped the returning residents into three main categories. So first, we have your Singapore citizens and permanent residents. And secondly, those holding MOM issued passes. And lastly, those holding ICA issued passes. Now, in terms of the entry approval requirement, this was implemented in early February to stem the number of imported cases. So the entry approval process applies to those holding MOM and ICA issued passes, as well as those holding in-principle approval or IPA letters. Now, the entry permission from MOM was initially required only for those who had a travel history to high-risk countries. Now, by the end of March, due to a spike in the number of imported cases, the entry permission was then required for all work pass holders and the dependents traveling from any country into Singapore. So even when the entry approval from MOM first became a requirement in early February, already very limited numbers, and we're talking roughly about 200, were only being approved on a daily basis. So by 23rd of March, MOM announced that they would only be approving entry approvals for those that are in essential services, such as healthcare and transport. And today, what MOM is saying is that while entry applications can still be filed, in reality, the chances of obtaining an approval is really very slim. So if the entry application is approved, the individual must then travel within the specified dates indicated on the email, and that is usually a day before, on, and after the intended travel date. Now, the conditions for entry approval currently requires employers to notify the employees on the need to serve a 14-day stay-home notice in a dedicated government facility. And so what this means is that upon arrival in Singapore, employees and their dependents will be sent direct from the airport to the dedicated government facility, and that is usually a hotel. So the employees must also have local mobile numbers in order for the authorities to contact them during the 14-day period. And if employees have dependents who are traveling back to Singapore, the responsibility to ensure that the employee's family members adhere to the stay-home notice. Now, this requirement falls on the employee, but the entry approval must still be obtained by the employer. So here I just wanted to pause to stress how important it is for employers to ensure that all their employees and dependents fully understand the requirement of obtaining the entry approval, as non-compliance will result in very severe penalties, both to the individual as well as to the company. So penalties include the immediate cancellation of the pass, and a very short time frame is then provided to the company to repatriate the individual. MOM will also impose a permanent ban on the individual's ability to reapply for the pass. And at the corporate level, there are also harsh penalties. The company will not be able to apply for new work passes for a year, and if there is failure to repatriate the individual by the given date, the company will then also be barred from renewing existing passes. So in terms of ICA issued passes, the entry approval is a relatively new requirement that took effect in late March as compared to MOM, and this is for long-term visit passes and student passes issued by ICA. And for ICA issued passes, the approval is a little longer as compared to MOM, and this is for a period of 2 weeks. So similarly, failure to obtain the entry approvals can result in severe consequences such as entry refusals, and the individuals will also need to fly out within 48 hours at their own cost. Now, in addition, the pass may also be revoked or the in-principle approval withdrawn. So going on to the next step in terms of the health declaration. Now, to monitor the health and travel history of all travelers, the Singapore government has made it mandatory for all travelers to provide a health declaration prior to entry, and this is done via the SG arrival card. The health declaration requires the individual to provide his or her travel history, and if this is not completed, the individual will also not be able to clear Singapore immigration. So in terms of the health declaration, this filing can be done up to 3 days prior to arrival. And again, this is via the SG arrival card e-service. Because you can file 3 days prior to entry, if there are any changes, these must be updated before traveling and entry to Singapore. And once the health declaration has been completed, the individual will then receive an email notifying them on the 14-day quarantine or stay-home notice. And then on arrival in Singapore, the traveler will need to show the acknowledgement email either on the phone or a hard copy to the immigration officer in order to clear immigration. So in terms of penalties for the initial offense for failure to submit the declaration or for providing false information on the health and travel history, the individual can be fined up to 10,000 Singapore dollars. They can also be jailed up to a period of 6 months or both. And for subsequent offences, the fine is increased up to 20,000 Singapore dollars and a jail term of 12 months or both. So the last stage of the process is the quarantine order or QO and the stay-home notice. Now, for all travellers, including Singapore citizens, permanent residents, and all MOM and ICA issued pass holders, as well as IPA holders, it is necessary to isolate for a period of 14 days immediately following entry into Singapore. So since April 10, all returnees will be required to serve their stay-home notices in dedicated government facilities. Now, similarly, failure to comply with the quarantine order or stay-home notice also carries heavy penalties. And for Singapore citizens, there can be a fine of up to 10,000 Singapore dollars, a jail of up to 6 months, or both for the first offence, and heavier penalties will be imposed for subsequent offences. Now, for Singapore permanent residents and long-term pass holders, their passes can also be revoked, or the duration of the pass may also be shortened. And as for employers, they may also be penalized and may have their work pass privileges withdrawn. So Anu, if you could just move on to the next slide. Now on this slide, I'd like to just quickly touch on the impact of the circuit breaker on case processing in Singapore. As we all know, the circuit breaker was implemented to introduce strict safe distancing measures to significantly reduce the movements and interactions in public and private places. So this took effect on the 7th of April and was initially scheduled to end on the 4th of May, but this has since been extended to the 1st of June. So during this period, only essential services that support daily needs will remain open, and in line with this change, most of the MOM and ICA services have also been suspended, and only urgent matters will be attended to. So MOM has announced that for card registrations and deliveries, these services will be temporarily suspended. MOM has also stated that during this time, approvals for new work pass applications will be very limited, and those that are outside of Singapore will be rejected. So for those that are already in Singapore and where they have a change of employer, a new work pass application can still be filed for consideration, and if it does get rejected, an appeal can be made to show that the individual has not left the country. So where renewals are concerned, MOM has made concessionary arrangements to automatically extend most passes up to the 5th of June if the expiry is between the 6th of April and the 5th of May. Now, for those that require medical examinations, they will also be provided a grace period of up to 3 months to complete the medical examination, although MOM will still require the medical results to be uploaded specifically for the issuance of renewal cases. So those were the updates for Singapore, and I will now hand over to Kenny to speak to his country.
Thank you, Talia. So if we can move to slide 6, and slide 6 is actually a slide that we put together. I just wanted to do a quick overview of the region and highlight a few of the key destinations that I mentioned earlier. So slide 6 is actually a slide that we put together for a different webinar on the 8th of April. And then these were the numbers that we were looking at in Southeast Asia as of the 6th of April. And if you go to the next slide, Anu, this is the current state, or at least as of the 22nd of April. So in a span of just a little bit over 2 weeks, the numbers within the region have changed drastically. And so the playing field in terms of the immigration processes and the restrictions that are currently in place across the region have also changed quite dramatically. If we turn to slide 8, this is an illustration of the responses that we've seen around the region, including Singapore as another comparison point. And again, going back to the last few slides, Singapore is now actually the hardest hit country within the region in terms of identified COVID cases. So on slide 8, you can actually see the disparate responses around the region to the COVID-19 crisis. And so in the starting with the light blue triangle, that's when the first confirmed cases were identified in those countries, mapped against the dark blue triangles, which is the first local transmission. And in terms of immigration, the pink circle is when the country first put an entry ban on Chinese nationals or travelers coming from China. And then the red circle is when a comprehensive entry ban was implemented throughout the country. So as you can see, there's quite a difference in terms of how the countries within the region have handled the crisis and how they've handled the entry ban specifically. So if I'll just turn to a few of these examples. Vietnam is one of those countries that acted quite early and closed off almost all travel from China as of February 1st. And this has actually seemingly allowed it to control the spread of the virus to the point where it's actually even started to loosen up some of its social distancing restrictions, as well as to resume processing of immigration applications starting last Thursday. Thailand and Indonesia, on the other hand, both countries acted relatively late. And in fact, in Thailand, you'll see on this slide that there's actually no pink circle. And that's because Thailand didn't even theoretically ban Chinese nationals specifically from entering the country until they suddenly and drastically curtailed all travel into the country on the 26th of March. Before that, there had been debate on suspending the visa on arrival for Chinese nationals and also all other visa on arrival eligible nationals in early February, but that actually did not materialize until the 11th of March. And even then, that was still not a complete entry ban for Chinese nationals. For Indonesia, in many ways, it followed a similar path as Thailand, taking into account that it didn't even identify a COVID-19 case until the 2nd of March. Indonesia was quite late, or relatively late, with any entry bans by first only suspending visas on arrival and also visa-free entry for Chinese nationals on the 5th of February. But otherwise, they still allowed those that had obtained a consular visa or who had Indonesian permits, such as Indonesian stay permits, to re-enter the country. So it was a very ad hoc policy until only around the 2nd of April, when they finally placed an entry ban or a comprehensive entry ban on all foreign nationals. And the final country I wanted to highlight is the Philippines. And that's also another interesting case study. And for months, the president of the country actually had denied that there were many cases in the country until suddenly on the 12th of March, he announced a general community quarantine to be put in place on Metro Manila. And then on the 17th of March, which was only 3 working days after the general community quarantine was put in place, they implemented an enhanced community quarantine, or ECQ, which was actually one of the most extreme measures or the most severe measures taken in the region up until that point. And it was akin to the lockdown in China itself, or in Wuhan itself. At first, the government only gave foreign nationals 72 hours to depart the country, only to reverse course on that same day. So now no domestic inbound or outbound travel or international inbound travel is permitted, but international outbound travel is still permitted for foreign nationals, but it is now very difficult to find any flights out of the country. And the ECQ, which was expected originally to last until this Thursday, has now been extended to at least the 15th of May. So it has been extended twice. So we are waiting until the 15th of May now to see if it will be extended yet again. So that's kind of a state of play of those 4 Southeast Asian countries. Thanks, Ami.
Thank you, Kenneth and Dalia, for sharing your insights in the COVID-19 situation in the region in ASEAN due to the COVID-19 situation. And many thoughts come to mind. And one of the questions that I would like to ask, but before I do that, I would like to pause and inform the participants that you could send in your questions through the conversation, so show conversation button there, and you can send in your questions there, and we will pick them up and take those questions after this in conversation section with Fragment. You can also email your questions to Rachel, and we'll take those questions after that. Okay. Kenneth and Dalia, coming back to the question that I had, one of the questions was if a foreign employee's work visa will expire and if that person is not in Singapore or any other ASEAN location and they're unable to enter Singapore or that country right now, what should they do?
Dalia, you need to unmute yourself. Please press *6.
Thanks, Rachel, and sorry everyone about that. So now, I was saying that in terms of the first consideration, really, that is to determine where the employee is currently located. So if they're currently stranded, for example, Indian nationals who cannot at present return to India, right, because they're just suspending all flights into the country, then the critical task at hand is to work closely with the immigration authorities in that country to obtain extensions on their visas on an exceptional basis so that they don't become overstayers. Now, in terms of the renewal process for Singapore, it's possible to submit the renewal application even if the person is not in country. And this application for the renewal can be filed as early as 6 months prior to expiry. So processing-wise, it takes about 3 weeks for the Ministry of Manpower to approve. And once it has been approved, the renewal IPA for the S-Pass is generally valid for 2 months, and then for the EP, it's valid for 3 months. So hopefully that would be, sufficient time for them to be able to obtain the entry approval to return to Singapore. Now, but if that's not possible, one could also try to request for an extension of the IPA, but this is discretionary. And even if approved, what we are currently seeing is that generally IP extensions would only go for about a month at a time, and possibly you could only do that after a maximum of 2 times. So if after having done all of these steps, right, and the employee is still not able to obtain the entry approval to return to Singapore before the IP expires, then the company will need to file a new work pass application. Now, for an EP application, depending on the salary of the employee, a job posting may be required, and this will need to be timed properly because currently M1 is not accepting new work pass applications for those outside of Singapore until after the circuit breaker period is over. So essentially now more than ever before, companies will need to monitor very closely the expiries of all passes, file the renewals as early as possible, and to restrict business travel unless it is absolutely critical, because as we all know, entry approvals at this point, these are not currently being issued. So Kenny, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on your country?
Sure. It's quite tricky when it comes to the other countries because unfortunately, while the authorities in a lot of these countries have given concessions for foreign nationals whose visas have expired while they are in the country, those concessions actually have not necessarily extended out to those who are outside of the country or who chose to leave the country before their visa expired. So if they had an expiring visa but chose to leave the country before those lockdowns were put in place, most likely they will need to restart the process again and apply for fresh work authorization. And that's because the embassies and the consulates overseas, they generally cannot or do not assist or process renewal applications, although there may be some concessions developed in the next few weeks or months, particularly as the lockdowns in some of these countries are extended. I think there will probably be some further concessions for those who are expiring. Just quickly, I mentioned earlier that Thailand and Indonesia were quite late when it came to implementing travel bans. One area that they have been quite forward-thinking on is in the area of concessions. Again, for those people who chose to stay in the country. So in both cases, both governments have actually given a concession or automatic extensions for those people whose visas have expired while they're in the country. And just today, Thailand has also announced an additional 3-month automatic extension for such individuals to expire at the end of July.
Okay, good. Thank you, Dalia and Kenneth. So one takeaway for everyone is to plan ahead, look at the expiry, renewal dates, expiry dates right away, and then plan ahead of time. Just to write on the earlier question, what if someone has exited Singapore and is unable to return or is not contactable? Is the company able to terminate the employment if they wish to? And how should they go about? Again, it's a two-part question for Singapore and then ASEAN locations.
Thanks, Anu. So perhaps I'll start with Singapore. And to answer the first part of the question, right, for the cancellation process for Singapore, it really doesn't matter if the employee is not able to re-enter the country because the pass is cancelled online, right? And there's really no need for the employee to submit the original passport for the cancellation process. Now, however, it is necessary for the employee to send the work pass back to the company immediately, as the employer is responsible for returning the work pass card back to MOM within 7 days from the online cancellation. So in terms of the second scenario where the employee is not contactable, this can get a bit challenging and tricky, as you would still need to try and do everything possible to get in touch with the employee. Now, obviously, the need to contact the employee is important not just for immigration purposes, but also to close out any other employment matters such as salary. So on top of the usual mode of email and phone, I think one of the ways to check with the employee's family or the network of friends, business associates to try and reach the employee. So under the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act, or the EFMA, for those holding S passes, I did just want to call out that if the pass holder is permanently uncontactable or has gone missing, then the employer has the obligation to inform the Ministry of Manpower within 7 days of them being aware that the employer has become permanently uncontactable. So if after all the efforts, the company can show that they have made reasonable efforts to contact the employee, then the company can proceed to cancel the work pass, and they can also request to have MOM waive the return of the work pass card. Although this is not explicitly stated in the EFMA for employment passes, it is of course still best practice to do so and follow the same process for EPs, just to be sure that you're able to contact the employee and confirm that they have indeed departed the country. Because on a number of occasions, we've actually found that the employee was still in country and just wasn't contactable. So in terms of the online cancellation process for Singapore, that's really quite straightforward. Just to note that it has to be done now within 7 days after the last day of employment. So I think that there used to be a bit of a confusion there because folks felt that they could cancel it on the last day, but you do still have to keep the pass valid on the last day and only cancel it after that. So in terms of penalties, there is a financial penalty of 10,000 Singapore dollars for late cancellations. In practice, this is generally not imposed, but there's no saying when MOM would actually impose it on the company, so we do have to be quite careful. Kenny, perhaps you'd like to share on your countries?
Sure, thanks, Talia. So I think for the other countries in the region, it does really depend on that specific country and their departure or cancellation procedures. I think most countries are probably not as strict as Singapore when it comes to cancellations. So as with the last question, if the employee's visa is already about to expire before they've left the country, then in most cases you can just allow the visa to lapse. I think Thailand is probably one of the main exceptions to that, where you do have to file the cancellation within 15 days of the person's last day. But in most cases, the visa can be allowed to lapse. However, if the individual's left and they still have quite a bit of time remaining on their work visa, then the company should still take steps to properly cancel the visa status. So in some countries such as Indonesia and also the Philippines, there is a post-departure cancellation that can be completed, usually in the form of a notification to the relevant authorities. But it's important to note on that point that post-departure cancellation is not the ideal situation, and it's really only done for the benefit of the company. So if the employee then tries to re-enter those countries on that same seemingly valid visa, as it hasn't been canceled out physically or voided out in their passport, they may face challenges at the port of entry because on record, their visa has already been canceled. So the employee in those situations just needs to be counseled not to re-enter during the validity of their visa.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Kenneth.
Oh.
We couldn't catch the last words that you were saying.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I was just saying that for those, a post-departure cancellation is possible, but it's mostly for the benefit of the company. So if the employee tries to re-enter on a seemingly valid visa, but it's actually already been canceled in the system, they may face challenges at the port of entry. So the employee in those situations should just be counseled not to re-enter the country until after that visa has expired or they get a new visa.
Okay, thank you. My next question is more Singapore specific, and we all know that Singapore has temporarily suspended entry into Singapore for foreigners with valid visas. But if there is a role that is very critical for business, is there an appeal process, and how could a company or that person go about that process?
Thanks, Anu. Now, I think I've spoken quite a bit about the entry approval process, as well as the need to ensure that companies adhere to that process because of the severe penalties. But in terms of the entry approval, it applies to both, as I've said, to MOM and ICA issued passes. And at this time, that's actually correct that MOM is not approving many applications for entries. And generally, if they do, then it's only for those in essential services such as healthcare and transport. So that's right. I mean, what we are seeing is that a lot of companies are finding it almost impossible to obtain entry approvals from MOM. And we know that this has been very, very frustrating because we've heard of families that have been apart for quite some time, but they've not been able to return and be reunited. We've had some instances or success in terms of dependent passes being approved for re-entry, but it kind of seems that now these days these numbers are also being greatly reduced. So in one case, just to share, we tried to appeal where the father is alone in Singapore with young children with special needs, and the mother was still not approved to re-enter, even though she had to leave Singapore for really genuine reasons, as the father overseas was critically ill. So we can actually see that whether it is what the company may deem to be business critical, or even in situations where there's a need for the family to be unified or to together again, we're not seeing a lot of success in this approval process with MOM. Now, as I was sharing earlier, in some cases, because it's just been absolutely impossible to obtain the entry approvals, some folks have actually just gone ahead, disregarded, and then come back to Singapore without the entry approval. And as I said earlier, the failure to comply will carry very heavy penalties such as revocation of passes as well as government sanctions. So where the application process is concerned, this is relatively straightforward, but it does require the authorized employee of the company to log in using the company's court pass. So some of us may be aware that, with a lot of the EP online transactions that are being done with MOM right now, you can actually have a third party do it for you. But in terms of the entry approval process that currently sits with MOM, this has to be done by the authorized employee of the company. So in the application for the entry approval, you'll need to provide the employee's contact details. You'll also need to provide the country of departure as well as their planned travel date. And earlier, part of the conditions for the entry approval, the company will also need to inform the employer on the 14-day stay-home notice in a government facility. So in terms of knowing and timing when to apply for the entry approval, one can actually make use of the entry approval calculator on EMEA's website. And if approved, again, you just have to be sure that you strictly enter only on those dates that have been indicated in the approval email.
Okay, so a safe strategy for everyone would be just to be cautious and not keep the appeal process as a strategy and wait until the restrictions ease and MOM and ICA come back into a normal process, I guess.
Yes, that's right. Because we've actually heard of some companies also wishing to, engage with the Economic Development Board, but we haven't seen any success in that area as well.
Okay. And then finally, to do a bit of crystal ball gazing, once these restrictions ease and when we are in better control of the COVID infections, what, in your opinion, would be the new normal way of doing things, and what should companies try to do by looking ahead and prepare themselves for when these conditions ease? And this is for both Talia and Kenneth, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Andrew. I think I'll start off on this one. It's quite an interesting question because we actually held a conference last year where we were looking at disruptors to immigration, and I don't think any of us could have contemplated the sheer impact of such a pandemic that we're seeing now. But a lot of those things that we talked about then are probably going to be exacerbated by this situation. So one of those things that we talked about then was the shift to further digitalization in the processes. So a lot of the countries that we deal with within Southeast Asia have quite manual processes. But even before this crisis, we started to see movement towards further digitalization and online applications, even in countries like Indonesia. So we're probably going to start seeing more and more of that moving forward, and which is probably for the better. And I think coming out of this, what we'll see is those countries that were more fully online based will come out of this faster in terms of their immigration systems than those that were paper based or that remain paper based. The other thing that is probably going to be the new normal is more documentation, particularly for medical examinations. A lot of the countries did not, including Indonesia, including the Philippines, did not really have a medical examination requirement. And after this pandemic, they probably will start to add those into the requirements. Thailand, interestingly, does have a medical exam requirement, but a lot of the foreign nationals that we deal with are exempted from the requirement because they come under the Board of Investment or BOI process. So in the future, post-COVID-19, a lot of these medical requirements are likely to be tighter and to be further expanded. One other thing I wanted to touch upon was just the structure of the immigration systems themselves, and highlighting Philippines as an example. I think we will probably see more of a focus on the consular piece of the process, and probably more discretion will be given to consular officers moving forward. Again, more documentation such as the medical exam certificates may even be required for entry visas or business visa applications at the consulate. And turning back to the Philippines example, it's actually an in-country process right now. And moving forward, there had already been rumors that they were going to make it more of a consular-based approach. And this current pandemic is probably going to accelerate that trend.
Thank you. And I would have loved to go on and listen to you, but while looking at the chat box, we are getting a lot of questions. So I would like now to open it to the floor and listen to what, the questions that we have received, if that's okay with you, Talia and Kenneth. Thank you so much. This has been great listening, speaking, and learning from you. But I think we'll now bring you all the questions from the floor over.
Yeah, thank you, Anu. Thank you, Talia and Kenneth, for the insightful sharing. Now we are ready to take the questions from the participants. So if you have a question, do click on the speech bubble and then type in your question, and I'll be happy to read it out. So we do have a few questions lined up. So let me just start with the first one. For stay-at-home notice at government facilities, does it apply to arrivals from all countries now?
Yes, it does. It's for basically every single traveler that I've mentioned earlier in terms of the three groups, and it's for anyone coming from any part of the world. So initially, I know that they started with the UK and the US, and then it went on to the ASEAN and other countries like France and Switzerland and India, but it's now really everyone coming from everywhere.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, what passes are MOM and ICA issuing at this time?
So I've also touched on that a little bit in terms of, so we'll probably start with ICA right now. ICA adjudicates applications such as student passes and your PRs and citizenships. So if you have a work pass and you're currently in Singapore and you're applying for PR, or if you're already a PR and you want to apply for citizenship, then generally those would not be impacted, right? But it does take a long time for ICA to adjudicate and to review in any case. Student passes, generally the processing is fairly quick. You know, if you are a foreign systems school, then it can be processed in about a week. But I think, you know, it really depends on whether or not the student will be able to travel to Singapore and get the entry approval. Now, in terms of MOM passes, they are currently really only looking at renewal applications. And then for new applications, they are basically looking at those who are in country. So some scenarios would be where you have a newborn baby, right? Or perhaps, as I've mentioned earlier, you have an employee moving from company A to B, has been in Singapore all this time, has not departed, then yes, those types of applications will still be processed by MOM.
Okay, thank you, Dalia. So the next question, if I have a Malaysian or non-SPR senior appointment who had his EP application rejected during this period, can he still enter Singapore as a Malaysian once the CB is lifted? He needs to come in to settle his children into school. He will not start work in Singapore until his CP is approved. He is currently working in San Francisco. Yes.
All right, so he's Malaysian. He's currently based in San Francisco, right? And he doesn't hold any type of Singapore residency permit at all. He's just applying for the EP, is that correct? So it'll generally just be the same process, right? He can, at this current time when the circuit breaker period is still ongoing, in a sense, it is quite pointless to apply for the EP at this stage because it's going to be rejected. So I think in terms of timeline, you can apply for it once the circuit breaker period is over, and then once you have the entry approval, and once you have the IPA for the EP, then what you can do is try to apply for the entry approval to travel to Singapore. So there are no concessions for Malaysians. I think there was a lot of confusion in terms of Malaysians coming in, whether by land, by sea, or what have you, the different modes. But really, we've kind of streamlined it. So basically, unless you are providing essential services and you need to cross the border every day from Malaysia to Singapore, then you're not impacted in terms of the stay home notice or any other requirement. But for everybody else, it's the same process.
Okay. The next question is, typically in July, August, and September, they are the peak of relocation, and most of us are hoping for markets to open during this period. With the expected influx of the usual summer volume and backlog, what is the predicted timeline of processing new applications based on what you have observed? Do you think there will be priority queues or possibly express applications?
I think this is a general question that applies to all countries, and maybe I'll just start with Singapore. Now, I think what is reasonable to expect again is that, and we've had a lot of questions from our clients, right? Like, can we file the applications now, right? Put it in queue, and then once the circuit breaker period is over, then they would sort of be, attended to first. But I think, that's not the right way of doing it, because in any case, chances are it will be rejected. So if you think about it, what's reasonable to expect is that MOM will see a spike in all new work pass applications because, as we said, there will be businesses that still need to move very quickly, once they're coming out of this period, to fulfill business needs and to have projects completed that were on hold. So in terms of processing, I think it's good to assume, or it's safe to assume, that it's going to take perhaps longer than the standard 3 weeks. And I think you can say that safely for June, perhaps a bit of July, but it probably will taper off and things might get better. So it's going to be, I think, the same in terms of biometric registrations as well for Singapore, because even when things start to improve, there's always a fear that there would be a second wave of infections, right? So if you think about today where appointments, can be booked fairly close together for the biometrics, then with the safe distancing measures in place, I think it's only fair to assume that probably the slots will be spaced out, and so there will be fewer, that can be completed within a date. So it may take longer in terms of biometric registrations to be completed for Singapore.
I was just going to add for the other countries, I think, I was just going to add for the other countries, I think the same thing, that there will be quite a backlog of cases at the relevant government authorities. And the first batch that they are probably going to prioritize are those who were in the country and had expired, because those will be the first ones to be processed to be extended. So I think with that backlog in place, there probably won't be priority queues or possibly even express applications. So there will probably be further extended processing times for all countries.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth. So we have a question for Philippines. So if we have an Indian national employee in Philippines whose work permit is almost expired but unable to return due to the restriction of international flights, if he still have a few months left in his assignment, would you recommend company to extend his current work permit for him to stay in Philippines until the ECQ has been lifted?
Well, there's a couple of parts to this. So if the individual is in the country now and their work permit or work visa has expired while the ECQ is in place, the Philippine government has actually already given a concession that they will not be deemed to have overstayed, and they just simply need to file a renewal application up to 30 days following the lifting of the ECQ. So at the moment, because the ECQ is expected to be lifted on the 15th of May, they'll have 30 days from the 15th of May to actually file an application. So if the person's assignment ends within that 30-day period, there's probably no reason to file an extension, and the person can just cancel their visa and then depart. But if they are planning to remain beyond, I guess in this case it would be mid-June, then the company should extend his current work visa.
Kenneth, sorry, you were cut off in the last sentence. Would you mind repeating?
Sure. I was just saying that if the individual's assignment will be ending within the 30 days following the lifting of the ECQ, then there's probably no reason to extend it. But if the assignment is extending beyond that point, then the company should extend their work visa.
Okay, got you. Okay, so the next question is, if we have a pending transfer case of an Indian national from Singapore to Thailand, in view of the current situation, what would be your advice in terms of work pass and dependent pass application in Thailand? Can we still proceed with the application? This is for a senior position.
Okay. So the short answer would be it depends, because it depends on the company's registration in Thailand and the process that you're going through. So currently, if your company is going through the Board of Investment process, the BOI process, the BOI is actually currently still processing applications for pre-visa approval. So that means you can file those applications pending the lifting of the entry ban. On the other hand, if it's a non-BOI process, the Department of Employment is not processing pre-work permit approvals at this time. So it comes down to which process you're going through. You can take some preparatory steps before the entry ban is lifted, but Thailand has actually just extended their entry ban on flights until the end of May. So likely the person won't be able to enter even until June at this point.
Okay, thank you. So one last question. We have a returning PR from Malaysia. Whole family holds PR status except in this scenario, what is the best shot for the EE to write into ICA for the child to gain entry?
I'm sorry, Rachel, you were breaking off, so I didn't get the full question.
Okay, so let me repeat. So we have a returning PR from the whole family holds the PR status except the youngest child. In this scenario, is the best shot for the EE to write into ICA.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel. I couldn't hear you.
Hey, Rachel, this is Elzon. So maybe let me repeat this question for Talia. So Talia, the question is, there's a returning PR from Malaysia, and the whole family holds PR status except for the youngest child. So is it the best shot for the assignee to write into ICA for the child to gain entry?
Yes, so I covered this a little bit. Thanks, Alzon. I covered this a little bit in the opening, where generally, if we look at those that have no residency status in Singapore, they're not allowed entry into Singapore, right? But if you have, if you're a child or if you're a spouse of a Singapore citizen and PR, then based on exceptional circumstances, you can write into ICA. You can get them to try and consider your request. You know, and if it's a young child, then obviously you want to mention that as well, because obviously they need to be careful. So yes, there is a possibility, but it is still discretionary.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Talia.
Thanks.
Okay, so due to the timing, we have to end the Q&A here. If you have further questions, you may contact Fragment after the event. So now I shall hand over to Elzon, our Vice President, now for the closing.
Thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. I know once Rachel mentions the closing, everyone's going to start dropping off the call, so I'm going to keep this short. I hope you find this ASEAN immigration focus webinar useful. I think when countries start coming up from COVID-19, our immigration partners are going to be at the forefront in guiding the relevant authorities to tweak and lift some of the current restrictions. And your feedback, your questions to us will enable us to serve a unique role in shaping some of those recommendations and some of the advocacy that we're doing with the government authorities. I want to thank our guests, Talia and Kenneth, for being a part of this webinar as well. Thank you for your partnership, and I'm sure that our guests, our attendees appreciate your insights too. I want to take this chance to highlight the COVID-19 microsites that both Cartus and Fragment have created. You can see it on the screen over here, and you can see the links to those microsites as well. Specifically for the Cartus microsite, this was created with the intent of giving you a centralized content hub for information, resources, and links to help you navigate the COVID-19 landscape. Our past and upcoming virtual events can actually be found on this page, and this includes the recording of today's event as well. It will be posted up in about 1 to 2 days' time. Our recommended best practices, client insights, pulse surveys, and white papers can also be found on this microsite. Now, as Rob mentioned when we did the first event, we're looking to host a series of webinars that's in light of the COVID-19 situation, and we want to host our next one probably in about 2 to 3 weeks' time. You can help to shape that. Please continue to let us have your feedback regarding the specific topics of focus or countries that you want us to look into. Look up for the post-event survey, which will be sent up by Rachel, our marketing team, and do visit our microsites to stay abreast of the latest COVID-19 developments. And with that, thank you. I look forward to welcome all of you again on our next webinar. Stay safe, stay well.